Hey everyone, thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Today's presentation is going to be a general introduction to the Yugoslavian family of SKS pattern carbines, better known the world over as the Papovka. In this video, we will go over the historical context, distinct mechanics and theory of use, a bit of social significance and the relative quality of these carbines compared to other SKS pattern carbines, and finally we'll briefly discuss considerations for civilian owners and collectors. With that in mind, if you have come to this video seeking some specific bit of information and prefer to not sit through the whole presentation, feel free to jump into the description and use the chapter system to navigate this video more efficiently. As a final aside, I should advise friends of this channel who have been expecting a part 4 to my relative quality series. This is it. I just decided to work it into a larger presentation because honestly it's pretty straightforward and it would have been about a 3-minute video otherwise, and I don't do 3-minute videos on this channel. So without further ado, let's dive in, beginning with a brief discussion of the historical context from which the Yugoslavian SKS emerged. So for anyone who isn't already aware, Yugoslavia has an absolutely fascinating and sometimes pretty terrifying history. We don't have time to really scratch the surface of that too deeply in this video, but suffice it to say, anyone who's interested in the history of human conflict and war fighting in the 20th century will find Yugoslavia to be a fascinating repository of data. To offer an extremely condensed version, the country which most of us think of as Yugoslavia was actually the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and it won its statehood during the Second World War. We in the West are quick to celebrate the anti-Nazi resistance movements in places like France, Belgium, and Norway, as well we should. But we often ignore that such efforts were utterly dwarfed by the resistance organized by the Southern Slavic people, communists or otherwise. While heroic Western European insurgents risked their lives to sabotage and undermine their occupiers, the Yugoslavian populace as a whole exhibited a far more ferocious approach to subjugation by organizing a grassroots guerrilla fighting force that grew to be many hundreds of thousands strong. While small bands of French heroes fought from the shadows, literal armies of predominantly Serb and Croat partisans directly engaged the enemy in pitched battles, fearlessly instigating bloodbaths which resulted in enormous casualties for both sides. I encourage my American and Canadian viewers to remember that when our fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers were fighting in places like North Africa, Italy, Greece, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally Germany, they were spared the full might of Axis forces because hundreds of thousands of Bolshevik Slavs had at least the intestinal fortitude to fight their own battle for freedom. Whatever righteous animosity you and I might hold towards any regime that flies a red flag, it does still behoove us to acknowledge that few people in history have sacrificed more for self-governance than did the Yugoslavians. And in the winter of 1945, there was little debate as to who had earned the right to set up shop in Belgrade. In the eternal spirit of finding common ground with those with whom we otherwise disagree, I feel there's no better way to salute Yugoslavian history than by quoting the fictional American hero, Lieutenant Aldo Raine. When it comes to killing Nazis, I think you show great talent, and I pride myself in having an eye for that kind of talent. So that's SFR Yugoslavia, a communist country inhabited by a range of ethnically and culturally diverse people whose primary unifying trait is a fanatical devotion to self-governance. Totally unrelated for all my literature buffs out there, that last sentence utilized a device called foreshadowing, but we can deal with that later, which coincidentally is also the attitude of the new Yugoslavian regime. Spoiler alert, it ends poorly. In the meantime, however, Yugoslavia was actually a general success story as far as communist industrialization goes, and they built a pretty robust economy without accidentally starving tens of millions of people to death, which is pretty impressive compared to other SKS-producing nations. So let's start talking about rifles. By virtue of how it was created, the new SFR Yugoslavia inherited a suspicious number of 98 pattern Mausers and 8x57mm ammunition. It's kind of like how the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan inherited a suspicious number of M4s and 5.56 NATO, but that's none of my business. Unlike the Afghan bounty, however, the Yugoslavian stockpile was being made rapidly obsolete in the late 40s and early 50s. So like many other young blossoming communist countries, they looked to Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet arsenal for support. Like East Germany and China before them, they received a formal technology transfer for the SKS-45. This occurred in 1959 and included 3,000 parts kits, a complete technical data package, and a delegation of technical advisors, many of whom were presumably the same individuals involved with the establishment of Type 56 carbine production at State Arsenal 296 in China. So individuals like the tool expert Beria, assembly expert Liskin, and the design expert Malantsev. And these are all individuals named in Chinese documentation of the establishment of Type 56 carbine production. All of this took place at the legendary Zastava factory, which was then and is still today one of the best established arms manufacturers in all of Europe. For reasons I don't fully understand, Yugoslavia was extremely sluggish to tool up and get moving and didn't formally begin production to replace their M48 Mauser variant until 1964. This initial production run was pretty small and is estimated to be between 2,500 and 45,000 units over the next 3 years. Obviously, it's a pretty big range, but they're both really small numbers when you think about other countries' SKS productions. These early M59 variants were essentially perfect clones of the late pattern Soviet SKS-45, with the only significant mechanical difference being the lack of a chrome-lined bore, a detail which we will discuss extensively at a later point in this video. In 1967, Zastava independently integrated a rifle grenade launching capability into the platform and produced about 73,000 of these so-called M59-66 rifles over the next 2 years. As an interesting side note, it appears that this rifle grenade launching technology was actually developed as part of a prolonged Yugoslavian effort to reverse engineer and design their own Kalashnikov variant, and wasn't originally intended for the SKS platform. It wasn't until 1969 when the night sight capable M59-66A1 variant was released that production really began in earnest, churning out somewhere between 550 to 650,000 units over the next 20 years, the vast majority of which were made between 1969 and 1979. The entire M59 series, to include the original 1960s M59s all the way up to the late 80s M59-66A1s, are all commonly called Papovkas, which is a endearing term for the abbreviation PAP, which is the Serbian abbreviation for Palomatska Pushka, which basically just means semi-automatic rifle. By the mid to late 1970s, the Yugoslavian investment in the Kalashnikov pattern was really starting to bear fruit, and they increasingly and wisely began to focus on their domestic M70 production examples, which is a fascinating story in its own right, but is ultimately beyond the scope of this video. They did, however, continue abbreviated M59-66A1 production and continued issuing the platform to reserve elements as well as distributing them as military aid to communist insurgencies the world over. The Yugoslavians had learned from the Chinese that the SKS thrived in the hands of irregular guerrilla forces, and the addition of anti-armor capability in the form of a rifle grenade launcher only added to this application. The Yugoslavians were second only to the Chinese in identifying low-intensity conflicts in which the SKS would genuinely outperform modern designs and putting the right weapon in the right hands. In 1991, our story came full circle as multiple of the distinct ethnic cultures that made up the Yugoslavian conglomerate decided that they felt occupied rather than represented by the Belgrade government. And if there's one thing we all should realize at this point, it's that Southern Slavic people respond to occupation with tenacious and uncompromising violence. Over the next 10 years, ethnic Croats, Bosnians, Kosovars, Slovenians, Albanians, and Macedonians took arms against the Serbian majority, and with significant foreign intervention, a decade of war resulted in the formation of 6 independent states with at least 2 disputed territories. Not only did this proliferation of violence result in the widespread combat use of domestic SKS patterns and Chinese and Albanian rifles pumped in from the southern border, I should add, but in a huge loss of accountability of this military hardware. It's very rare today to see an Islamist militant weapon cache that doesn't include a healthy representation of former Yugoslavian hardware. So that history lesson took a little longer than I expected, but hey, I'd rather give you fine people too much rather than too little. You had a choice to skip ahead, and if you didn't take it, that's on you. So now let's talk about the mechanics and theoretical application of Yugoslav variants, because as previously established, they really did go above and beyond to make it their own. Again, I'm going to hold off on the chrome-lined bore debacle for now, but if you really just can't wait, you can always skip to that part if you want. It is important, and I'd rather face it head-on in its dedicated section. That's why I'm not talking about it now. For now, we'll start by looking at the M59, which I've previously established is just a regular SKS 45. I would say it's a particularly nice one, and I'll cover that again in my quality analysis, but for now we can just say it's a basic SKS 45. That said, these examples only represent about 4 or 5% of total Yugoslav production, so let's get ahead to the interesting part. With the M5966, you can see that all of a sudden we're dealing with a totally different beast. The core action is unchanged, but now we have a 22mm grenade launching muzzle device, a combined ladder sight and mechanical gas cutoff, and a rubber butt pad. That would be all you would see on a true M5966, but this is the much more common M5966A1 variant, which also includes a flip-up front night sight and rear night sight capability integrated into the existing rear sight. My example achieves this capability through luminous phosphor paint. However, a small number of examples manufactured in the late 1980s actually use radioactive tritium. So let's break this all down. When in standard configuration, this rifle will work just the same as any other SKS pattern carbine. You load, shoot, manipulate the weapon just the same as you always would. It takes the same stripper clips, the same ammunition in general, easy day. It should be noted, however, that the M5966 variant is going to be about 4 inches longer, right around 15 ounces heavier, and it's going to have a 3/8 inch length of pull increase over conventional M59 or just an SKS 45 in general. So obviously increases in gross dimensions are pretty much always a downside. You don't want extra length, you don't want extra weight to a point. But the increased length of pull is certainly something which can go either way. I imagine that some of you out there are gigantic Northwest European bullet magnet Neanderthal types. And you might actually like that. My highly efficient and compact Denisovan frame prefers traditional Warsaw Pact kind of length stocking, but I suppose that's operator preference at the end of the day. For the penalties you pay in length and weight, it should be noted that you are rewarded with one of the softest 30 cal recoil impulses on the planet, which is nice, but it's really not a good trade on its own because regular SKS patterns are pretty light recoiling anyway. Where those sacrifices really start to pay dividends is when you flip up that ladder sight, blocking off the gas port, chambering a specialized projectile-less cartridge. It's not technically a blank cartridge, but it is a blank. It's a grenade launching blank, and sliding a 22mm heat warhead onto the spigot. Now your little intermediate carbine can punch a fist-sized hole through more than 7 inches of armor. And that rubber butt pad should keep your stock from cracking against the ground, or might keep your shoulder from dislocating if you get down like that. I don't recommend it, but you do you. This is a particularly enormous force multiplier for that special breed of warfighter who forsakes combat boots for flip-flops and a plate carrier for a Super Bowl commemorative t-shirt for a team that didn't win the Super Bowl. All of a sudden, those ripe convoys of APCs and fighting vehicles just became legitimate targets for you and your militant buddies, even if Abu Hajar forgot the RPGs in the back of the Hilux. Furthermore, if you're initiating contact at dusk or dawn like you probably should be, your grenade launching spigot is now going to be doing double duty as a flash suppressor. So with the aid of your fancy glow-in-the-dark sights, you can keep a steady stream of well-aimed shots on target. Meanwhile, your panicked enemy is mag dumping in the bushes around you. In other words, the Yugo M5966A1 is longer and heavier than a traditional SKS pattern carbine, but offers massive real-world force multiplication for that weight. When we consider the already niche guerrilla warfare application in which the SKS actually makes sense, this is a really, really good deal. If you imagine a handful of guys with 5966A1s, a couple dudes with backpacks full of rifle grenades, one support gunner with an RPK or RPD or something, and maybe a team leader with an AK, you're looking at an ultra-light, ultra-mobile, and logistically simple element which is capable of causing real headaches for any military force on Earth. So for all of those reasons, I do consider this rifle to be the highest expression of the combat SKS. It's not necessarily my favorite to take to the range, or probably not the one I would recommend always to new owners, but if we were to have a serious conversation about what, if any, SKS has a place on the modern battlefield, there's no question in my mind. It's got to be the Yugoslavian M5966A1. It's still suboptimal in the grand scheme of things, but I think it's fair to say that it's got a place in the conversation, and that's a pretty significant accomplishment for any SKS. To make it simpler still, the Yugos took a good rifle, They introduced logical and well-executed enhancements, and they made a good rifle better. Thumbs up to Zastava and the M5966A1. So now let's talk about quality, because none of those whiz-bang features are worth much if the gun isn't well made, right? I would best describe Yugo SKS quality as infuriating. Okay, that's, in fairness, probably not the best description, so let's call it almost perfect. It's infuriating to me because it was so close to being perfect and so close to being the highest quality SKS pattern ever produced, but not quite there. So let's get into it. So the machining ranges from excellent to best in class. Their pocket milling isn't always as clean as the best Soviet examples I've ever seen, but it always greatly exceeds minimal functional standards, and frankly, even the perfections exude a level of professionalism and attention to detail that I think is absent in some of the more utilitarian Chinese examples. Externally, the fit and finish is peerless, or at least shares an elite peer group with examples like final production run State Arsenal 296 stuff. The bluing is rich and dark, and sometimes the sunlight will catch it just right and you'll get hints of that gorgeous plum heat treat that makes comblock CNR guys like myself blush a little bit. The stocks are rock solid and the tolerances are boringly consistent. The actions are crisp, the mag locking tab interfaces with an unmistakably positive authority. They're just so good. I can recognize the sound of a Yugo being manipulated with my eyes closed, and they're just magical rifles in my opinion. Oh, did I mention that they're also the most accurate? Obviously, individual examples will vary, but it's been my and many other high-volume SKS shooters' experience that statistically speaking, the tightest SKS groups disproportionately come from Yugo examples. So why on earth, fans of my relative quality series might ask, did I give the Chinese the nod for top quality if the Yugos are so darn good? Well, most of you already know why, and it's the elephant in the room that I've been dancing around this whole video. They don't have chrome line bores. None of them. That feature that every other reputable SKS pattern carbine producer found essential, the Yugoslavians said, nope, we don't need it. We could, despite what the Reddit shock troops have claimed for decades. Reddit's probably not been there for decades, but those people have been out there for decades, and they've been spreading misinformation on other platforms. I digress. Despite what some people have claimed for periods of time, Yugoslavia has perfectly adequate chromium deposits. The technology is well established, or was well established, and clearly the international standard moving forward. But not us, said Zastava. That'd be a waste of our time and money. Don't need it. Surely you viewers at home are saying that's because they must have been early adopters of non-corrosive ammunition. Surely they justified this bizarre choice because their issued ammunition would not pose an existential threat to the long-term health of the weapon system. Nope. They use this stuff. M67 ball. In addition to being one of the most powerful, accurate, and terminally effective 7.62 by 39 rounds ever fielded, it's super corrosive. Somehow it's like extra corrosive, if that's a thing. I don't know, I'm not a chemist. In any case, many Yugoslavian SKS pattern carbines exhibit moderate to severe bore corrosion, vastly disproportionate to their intended service life. In fairness, I should point out from a historical perspective that the actual Yugoslavian military seemed pretty disciplined with maintaining their rifles, and the reports of this being an issue in actual military service are not super compelling, but that was before the war and before they got surplused and disappeared. And in that time, a whole lot of them have gotten jacked up under circumstances that would not have jacked up a chrome line bore. So it is what it is. It's a big deal to me. I can fix a broken stock with roofing nails and duct tape. I can ignore a cosmetic end mill mark. That doesn't bother me. I can tolerate a wobbly gas tube. I'm not going thumb over bore. I can't sleeve a bore, though. I can't chrome line a bore. And even if I could, would that really be worth it? No. So where do the Yugos stand overall? Well, I don't really feel comfortable ranking them. They made it hard for me, but I know I can't put them in first. If you've got a good Yugo with a mint bore and you feed it non-corrosive ammo or just maintain it properly, it may well be the highest quality SKS you ever own. But that trust isn't there for me, and that matters. So lastly, what considerations are there for a civilian gun owner, collector? Is a Yugoslavian SKS pattern carbine a good choice for you? My answer is, of course, a big fat, it depends. If you're a collector, the obvious answer is yes, because the goal of a collector in life is to collect everything, and you should definitely have a fascinating, combat-tested, and historically significant SKS variant. Even if you're a stamp collector, you should have that. Get one, hang it on the wall, have something to talk about at parties. As a shooter, however, it depends. It depends what you're into. First, be aware that you should check the bore before purchase. Now, some of you out there are saying, I check the bore anyway. Great, that's a good habit to be in, but SKS bores are typically doing really good, the chrome-lined ones anyway. As a general rule of thumb, if you buy a Type 56 carbine, sight unseen, the odds are heavily slanted in your favor. If you buy an M59, not so much. Now, I should note that if you get to select your rifle and your goal is to get the most accurate SKS carbine you can possibly get, and you do not have the opportunity to shoot it beforehand, based on my experience, your statistically best choice is to get a Yugo, any Yugo, from a 1980s 5966A1 to a early 60s M59 with the best bore that you can find. And again, individual examples will always vary, but that would be my advice for just hedging your bets to find the most accurate SKS pattern carbine. If for whatever reason you're just trying to get the tightest groups, it's still an SKS. I mean, don't expect to be doing much better than 2 MOA, but if you're trying to get right to 2 MOA or maybe a little bit under, that would be where I would start. So now let's talk about the big thing though, which is the fact that 95% of the SKS pattern carbines on the civilian market, at least the US civilian market where I live, are gonna be M59, 66, or 66A1s. And that means that you are going to be dealing with those dimensional compromises that are based around a feature that you as a civilian will probably not get to use. So obviously I'm talking about the rifle grenade launching capability. What does that entail again? Well, it's 4 inches of additional barrel length, 15 ounces, give or take, of additional weight. For anybody who's not familiar, 15 ounces is about a pound, and 3/8 of an inch, give or take, of additional length of pull. Again, the length of pull might be a preference for you if you're a bigger guy, and if you're a bigger guy, then those extra inches and extra ounces might not be as big of a deal to you. Additionally, I always encourage people to just be realistic about what are you using it for. If you're pulling it out of the back of your trunk, walking 15 feet to a shooting bench, setting on a sandbag and shooting away, first of all, more power to you. That's an awesome way to enjoy firearms, but you don't really need to think about stuff like an additional 4 inches or, an additional 15 ounces. In fact, you'll probably enjoy that because it'll divert the blast a little bit further away from you, and that tiny little bit of additional weight is going to soak up that recoil just a little bit better. Now, if you're the type of person who buys an SKS, throws on your flip-flops and rice hat and runs off into the woods immediately, again, super legitimate way to enjoy firearms, those dimensional differences become more important to you. You got more snag potential. You're just carrying more weight. Ounces make pounds. Pounds make calories. Calories make bodies. So those things matter, and that's just an individual choice. I can't make that for you. You just got to consider that. One of the benefits of the SKS for a lot of people, one of the selling points, is it's a pretty light, handy carbine, and the 5966 is not as light and as handy of a carbine. Now, in a military context, sacrificing that little bit of lightness and handiness, I think makes so much sense, because you can all of a sudden absolutely up armored vehicles, which is super important. But if you're not actively up armored vehicles, then not so important. Now, we'll go into the last thing here too, which is that you can get inert dummy rifle grenades and you can launch them. And I've never personally done that on an M59 66. But I have shot a lot of grenades, not a lot, but I've shot enough grenades to know that grenade launchers are super fun. Here's a clip of me launching grenades at one point a while ago. And it is a blast. If you think shooting is fun and you've never shot a grenade, and at any point in your life you get the opportunity to take it, it's kind of what I imagine golf should be, or like maybe it's how other people experience golf. I don't know. But just watching that thing just fly away from me at relatively low velocity, so you can track it in flight, but it's still absolutely delivering it, unlike a golf ball. I mean, you know, those grenades in those clip were, I think I was shooting out to like 1750. So these things will soar. And obviously it's super fun when the grenades hit, they explode. But even if they're chalk rounds or just a decoy, I mean, people throw footballs in their backyard. Imagine just taking a football and just throwing it 200 yards. It's a blast. There are safety concerns associated with that. You need to make sure your dummy grenade is made for launching. You need to make sure it's correct for your pattern. You need to make sure the weight's correct. And probably most importantly, you need to make sure you're using a correct, either an original or a correct facsimile of a grenade launching blank. You don't want to be using just regular blank ammo. Have I done that and lived to tell the tale? I'll leave you to speculate on that. But as a professional on the internet, I'm going to tell you, only use the correct ammunition. Pressure curves are goofy. Even if the blank is less powerful, the pressure curve can create a danger. And yeah, there's definitely risks associated with grenade launching that are not associated with just regular firearms usage. So I think the main takeaway from this story is grenade launchers are fun. Another important consideration is that the night sights, a critical advantage of the 5966A1, those are going to be expired. The phosphor paint's not going to work. The tritium, if you're lucky to have one of the tritium ones, those are going to be well past their prime. So certainly you could replenish that if you wanted to, but that's going to be a lot of work. And when you pick that up off the shelf, you're not going to have working night sights. All right, everybody, that's my video. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch it. I feel like I left some stuff out, but I kind of feel that way with every video. There's not a video I've ever made that I wouldn't go back and change. And some of them I'm so aggravated by, I'm going to totally remake. So I guess that's just normal, and we're just going to go ahead and send it anyway. If you found anything valuable in this video, I would greatly appreciate if you could do me the courtesy of hitting like, hitting subscribe, and if you left me a comment, that'd be awesome too. Don't want to do that. I get it. I know I'm asking for a lot. Keystrokes, pretty difficult. I'm just kidding. I'm terrible at subscribing to good content makers. I'm not saying I'm a good content maker, but when I see someone who I learned something from, I don't hit subscribe as much as I should, and I appreciate that more now that I'm putting myself out on the internet for likes. So, yeah. Hope to catch you next video.